Okay, so it is 10:03 a.m. I'm going to call the meeting of the Affordable Housing Trust Fund to order and make initial announcement that this meeting is being audio and video recorded. And do I have a motion to approve the agenda?
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Do I have a motion to approve the minutes listed here?
So moved.
Second.
Any comments or corrections? All those in favor of approval?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Okay, the first item on our agenda is a closing cost assistance application. And the documents should be in the packet. Does anyone have any questions?
Well, I noticed there wasn't a property listed that they're applying for.
Okay.
It seems like they want to be pre-approved. Unless I'm wrong,
Yeah, that's exactly.
but I don't
believe we,
I don't
Have ever
think we
done
can yeah, I don't see how we could do that.
okay. So do we suggest a motion to postpone until the applicant can return with a specific property? And because we do require a purchase and sale agreement as part of the
Yes,
application
yeah.
process. So I guess we
Yeah.
don't even need to take a motion, right, on that?
Yeah, they also haven't taken the first time home buyers education class, and then they say they're fourth time home buyers. I don't know if that's gonna be a problem. Are covenant homes for first time home buyers?
Not necessarily, no.
Okay,
It's,
all right.
I think you're not allowed to own any other property
Okay,
at the time you purchase, but
Okay.
you don't have to be a first-time
Right.
home buyer.
all right,
However, we should probably clarify whether the person is required to take it regardless of whether they're a first-time home buyer or not.
right.
So,
Especially if they might have been overseas before and they may not have been in Massachusetts. We don't know.
right,
So,
right. So I'm going to suggest that Megan notify the applicant of,
Yeah,
These-
I've already done that.
okay,
And I still have to present what's given to me, but I let him know to keep me in the loop so I can bring it to the board as he goes through the next steps of being qualified, targeting a property, and those sorts of things.
okay. So I'm going to recommend that it be re-added to the agenda at such time as the application is complete.
and should we turn back to you, Megan, the confidential paperwork
Yeah, if
here?
you wanna-
Okay.
Put it back here and I'll get into
The-
the
Into the shred pile. Okay. Okay. We have, the next item on the agenda is the signing of the Monahanset deed. I'm going to ask Megan to give us an update on that.
Continue. We haven't gotten it after.
Okay, so we'll continue that until our next meeting. Any word from,
They were supposed to have it, I spoke with town council a week or two ago and.
so it's just making its way through the legal process. Okay, all right. I guess the next item on the agenda, meeting recording update, is self-evident. Here we are.
I just wanted to confirm with you guys that NCPA got back to me. I know they charge the town at the $50 an hour, and that's the rate that I discussed with them, but that is going to be our going rate, $50 per hour. So that's kind of what I wanted to update everyone on. That is in fact what we'll be paying.
I'm really grateful we're doing it. I've had people ask questions about things that if we had it online, you could say, just go check it out. So that's very good, especially with the current select board race and things like that. Some people may want to know more about things here.
And I'm also going to make a placeholder for us to request that it be put in the budget for 2020, that the town find money to include us in the recording budget. Is that?
Do you want a motion?
I think that probably makes sense.
Okay, move to do what Brooke said.
So any second? Second. So the motion is to request that the town administration include funding for recording of Affordable Housing Trust Fund meetings. Any discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Passes unanimously. Okay, next up on the agenda, Tacoma Green Professional Services escrow account. And I'm going to ask Megan. Megan asked to put this on the agenda, and Tucker may have some information on it. So I'm going to see if we know what's going on there.
As to, I dug through minutes, I couldn't find the specific call out for this, but I'm under the impression that $5,000 at some point was pledged to help with professional services at Tacoma Green. We have since used up that budget of $5,000, so it's at that point now. Is the trust going to approve more funding, or is it going to fall on the applicant? But I think Tucker would maybe know more background. It was before my time.
Yeah. I don't know if I have time to get additional. My understanding from our conversation is that this is related to the expense of consulting engineering that reviews the engineering plans for the property. So in this case, it's Pesci, the town's consulting engineer.
I think you need to be at the microphone. Sorry, we're still getting used to that.
Yeah, I don't know if I have tons of additional insight other than conversation that Megan and I had about it prior, but I believe that this is related to the engineering review performed by the town's consulting engineer, Ed Pesci, on the engineering plans for the project. And this being a town-sponsored project, I think the trust had originally voted, it's probably a couple of years ago now, to support the cost of that engineering review. And my understanding is that it more recently had been completed in terms of once the applicant was through both the planning board and HDC processes and revisions that resulted to the site plan as a result of the HDC process. Originally, it was a 3-building complex. It ended up being a 4-building complex. So anyway, obviously there were refinements that came along the way, and that final engineering plan was completed at some point, I'm guessing last summer or fall, and that review was done. And so I think this is sort of the final element, I believe. Megan, do you know, like, what is there a number in excess of the original 5,000?
It's like a couple $100. He adjusted his last invoice to be able to have it paid completely. But I think I'm under the impression it's still ongoing with Ed's review.
Well, so I mean, I think at once the project gets going, he would go and do actual site reviews of progress along the way. But at the moment, it's still in appeal. So I wouldn't anticipate any additional engineering review expense in the short term. Yeah. Depending on what happens with the appeal.
So there's an outstanding bill for several $100s. Do we know that? We don't know the exact amount. Okay. Does anyone have any questions or comments?
I would just wonder at some point, I would think that would be the kind of thing that the town would routinely cover, review, just like any other project, private or public. So I don't know whether there's a point that is beyond the initial development where it shifts into a stance that it's not something we have to invest in. Particularly, it's something that's routinely part of his contract. So if it's possible to inquire just both about the status and any pending balance and then any anticipated future balance, we can't really do anything without that, can we?
Yeah, what's the intended future scope of work?
Rima?
Tucker, do you know if this is part of the 300,000 that we voted to allot to Tacoma Green infrastructure? I thought
For
that
the
was-
roadway,
Yeah.
at the 400,000.
Oh, 400.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, I would think this is not, it would not like be considered part of that
Because
contribution.
I don't remember this at all, but that doesn't mean.
Yeah. I mean, I'm guessing it dates back to the original, a couple of years ago when the original application was awarded and the work was begun.
Do you know, going back that far, was there an estimated amount that this was looking at, like to?
I don't recall like an estimated amount for Ed's review.
Okay.
Yeah. But we can certainly, we can get together with Andrew along the lines of the questions that Judith asked and get some more clarity.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think the common sense thing to do here is to continue this agenda item for further information with regard to the outstanding bill and any expected future expenses and how they relate to the contract with Halkeen as to who's responsible for those costs.
I apologize. I walked in late. What's the amount of the bill now?
A couple $100, but we don't have an exact number. So,
Okay. And it probably came with net 30 terms, or is it?
I don't
there's
know that Megan
there's an
really
ongoing
knows.
billing cycle with their group. Okay.
yeah. So Megan's just coming back in the room. So Megan, you don't have an exact number, right? So, I mean, we could say approve up to $500 to clear the existing bill
Okay.
and then hold the rest of the discussion for later. How does that sound to
Okay.
people? Can I have a motion?
So moved.
And
Second.
second.
Any discussion?
No.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Motion passes unanimously. I'm going to pass the meeting over to Mr. Sullivan, the chair, who has arrived.
Thank you. We'll move on to item number 8, the fire station report property draft, and look to Tucker for a review on the Board of Selectmen meeting presentation.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Tucker Holland, housing specialist. Yeah, I think it's fair to say that the presentation before the select board was very well received. The folks from Union Street Studio, who we had contracted with to do a study of the suitability of the site for development of housing, and or mixed use, and what that might yield in terms of units. That team did I think an outstanding job. What they ended up proposing, you can see in the presentation, was, or what I shouldn't say proposed, but what they illustrated, that we could end up with roughly 6,000 square feet of mixed use space that could be offices, community meeting space, retail, any number of things, TBD at a future date, in addition to yielding 30 units, which would count toward our SHI list under that particular configuration. And what kind of is interesting that came up during the discussion, I think the board is aware that the town has 2 departments that really are in substandard office situations today. And so the town had been looking at utilizing the existing fire station building for housing these departments for a period of time, be that, 1, 2, 3 year type of thing, maybe even creating some additional meeting space in the same facility. And so I think we're all very respectful of that urgent requirement. What came up during the presentation was that, in fact, the type of plan that was proposed could be done in phases that would both allow that use in terms of the town departments and still be able to proceed with the housing component on the site. And so the select board ultimately, I believe, voted unanimously to, continue along this process. So we need to circle up on, next steps and so forth. And Libby actually would like to have a, call it a work group meeting following the annual town meeting. So that is something that's in the works.
Okay, so at this time, for this group to help move this forward, what would you be looking for from us?
At the moment, there's not anything that the board needs to act on immediately. I think the select board expressed their appreciation for the group putting together this analysis. I think they thought it was very thoughtfully done, and that they'd like to see it carried forward. But I think it's important at this next step to work with town administration and the folks at Libby may be thinking to be part of this on, okay, what might the next steps be from there and the timing and so forth.
So
Great. Thank you, Tucker. Brooke?
I'd just like to reiterate to the public and for the record that these are not a plan. It's a conceptual design, and our mandate was to determine whether the site was viable for affordable housing or mixed use development. And that's what this architectural firm was engaged to do. And I just want us to be careful that this isn't a definitive plan. It's a concept to be worked out in a much more thorough planning process going forward. So there's been some confusion about that in the public space, and I just wanted to clarify that.
Could I add just a little more texture? Because I was at the meeting. I know Charity Grace was too, as was Brooke, and maybe you were too. But just to add a couple of other things, Libby seems, my understanding about that work group was that she was hoping to gather up a better plan for town space, for town office space, rather than a work group about this particular project. Did you have a different understanding, Tucker?
Yeah, she may not have spoken about it at the select board meeting, but subsequently sent an email about it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, just so everybody knows, some of the discussion at the meeting was there's needs for town departmental space, not only, I think, for the two units you referenced, but personally, I think the planning department needs better space, and there's probably others that do as well. And I wonder, for example, about the, she also said, second thing I thought folks would want to be aware of here, that initially her reaction was she didn't like the idea of commercial retail, which this group had talked at some length about. But I thought the way the portrayal by the architects went, it suggested that spaces that are on the lower level could be used either for offices or for meeting space or a variety of other things. So she was kind of catching up on some of those points. I've wondered, this may not be relevant here, but just in case this is something to be passed on, I've wondered why health and that kind of thing isn't co-located with Wannacomet Water, because I would think that for lab space or other kinds of things like that, that there might well be additional area located there as opposed to trying to move them twice and that kind of thing. So I don't know what the upshot would be, but my sense was the board was quite enthusiastic about this, and that the damper was coming from Libby was my impression. Others had to the degree there was a damper, she wasn't objecting, but that seemed to me a couple of things about the meeting worth bringing up. The other thing I can't help but mention is I think there's going to be some debate, maybe this is later in our meeting, but among the various items up for town meeting, about which of numerous projects we choose if we have to choose among them. And I don't know whether we're in a position to think about that at this point or at some point, but I would bet that insofar as this may end up with more coverage in the press or discussion among the public or whatever, that there's going to be some choices ahead. This one isn't as mature as some of the other options, but I think we need to think about that. The other thing is there was some discussion not only about phasing, but about the adequacy of parking here. And I worry about street side parking in an area that is really very kind of dicey the way the traffic flow goes through there anyway. There was a point at which when Atlas was still across from Stop and Shop, Planning Board was being asked to authorize street parking there, and we said no. So some of the select board also commented about possibly tweaking parking because the current concept is just one space per unit. Plus, if there were employment there for how many of our staff go with those functions, plus if there's meetings there, one has to wonder what's going to happen with that. The architects said that they thought they could tweak parking further, but I just wanted to add a little of that flavor in detail. And to be sure, if I'm wrong on any of my recollection, you tell me
I think
get it straight. Thanks.
All of your recollections are spot on. I mean, I don't know that and I think you said this, I don't know that I would characterize it Libby had a damper on it, but I think, as you said, she may have been catching up with some of the elements. And of course has this more urgent concern, if you will, about the two departments that are in the substandard situation. But I think you captured it very well. I think the parking element is definitely something that will get analyzed and discussed in much greater detail once the programming is further developed. So sort of to Brooke's point, I think this board answered the question that it was asked to by the select board in terms of, is this potentially suitable for housing? What might that look like? And we kind of got the green light that, hey, we like this initial thinking about how to use this. And so now there are a lot of details to look into.
But are they, to Brooke's point earlier, I had the impression the select board thought we would keep moving in some fashion, but these folks have satisfied their contract, right? So I don't know what keeping moving means or if there's a next phase of.
And that, I think that really coming out of the meeting that Libby is organizing following town meeting is going to get into
developing an RFP.
I think if we wanted to we wanted to really delve deeper at some point here, obviously, into the architecture and so forth, there probably would be an RFP at that point to contract with a firm. These folks would be certainly eligible to be responding to that. But I think that next meeting is the next step in the process.
So that's probably 2 months away then.
Probably is, yeah.
I'd like to, I feel like I want to keep this warmer than 2 months away, and I'm not sure how to do that as well, but maybe there's some things that can happen through your office and, an update to the next meeting, we can kind of move this along.
I mean, I think we can be talking about it in context of some of these other discussions, as Judith was referencing. I mean, as an example, there's several different things, as we all know, that are on the warrant related to housing. This may be an example of if we're purely focused on housing, like the biggest bang for the buck type of opportunity in terms of lowest cost to the taxpayer. that doesn't mean there aren't other things that are under consideration that are, very worthy of consideration. But so I think that this can be kept warm in the discussion of the different things that we can be doing that make sense in addressing our housing crisis.
But we don't have any even ballpark idea about cost of what they sketched conceptually, right? We know they wouldn't have to pay for land because the town owns the land, but and we know it'd be tear down and build maybe portion of it first, and then ultimately redoing the area where the fire station is, if that's been used temporarily for offices. But
I would say we haven't put together the numbers in that fashion yet, but it would be a fairly short exercise to come up with a financial pro forma for the site, making certain assumptions about utilization of tax credit, financing, and so forth. So we're not.
That might be worth having in your pocket, because somebody's going to ask that at some point in connection with evaluating other options.
So when we get through the Nantucket Inn this week, then we can turn to looking at that. Yeah.
So, Rima. Thank you.
We wouldn't be the developers. We're not developers. We would sort of decide what we want, or what the town wants, and then put an RFP out, and another developer would come on. So as far as our financial involvement, that's to be determined, but it's not like we would be paying to build the thing.
The only reason I say that is the sense of that meeting was the select board really valuing the expertise of this group. And so I wouldn't want to be flat-footed without some basic capacity to answer questions that might come up. Maybe that's a bad idea. I know you're right about the ultimate call, but
I think, as if I may, I think as important as cost, if not more at this phase, because this is a concept and a scope, would be more timeline. What is the kind of timeline that we're talking about through the process and kind of the steps of the process? So if there's a conversation about funding at this year's town meeting, are we talking about a RFP, a ground break, a concept that's 2 years to 3 years out, and then actually paying, working with the developer to pay construction costs 4 to 5 years, and where are we allocating funds depending on which rooms? I think timeline is as, if not more important today than, because we don't know what we're going to build. And I think that is a conversation that we should be moving forward to say, we want to keep this warm, get it hot. How do we kind of progress the timeline?
We're going to have
one sec.
Sorry.
Brooke, go ahead.
So I'm going to follow up on your word timeline here. And I think what we have to remember is that we are now a month out from town meeting, and there's a lot of work that's being done to prepare the warrant articles that are on this year's town meeting. And there's a question of bandwidth of people and resources to do anything. And I know the finance department is very busy. Town administration is very busy. Tucker is beyond busy. And I think that as much as I want to keep this warm, I think we have to respect the stuff that's in process now and know that this is coming. And I think it's premature to ask for financial, because I think it sends the wrong message if we were to price this, because this is not the plan. This is a concept. And I think for me, the timeline and the process is this work group that programs what goes into the space. We have an idea that we'll use some mixed use. We'll be doing some mixed use phased in development that will involve ground floor space that's for some public use. Retail was proposed here, but some people coming in off the street use with housing above it. But beyond that, we really don't know because we haven't talked to the constituencies. And there's a limited scope in terms of what this firm had in terms of information. It wasn't what they were charged with. So I don't want to get the cart before the horse and confuse the community that we're pricing out this when it's not a plan.
Right.
So the process is planning, which I think is what Libby is looking forward to doing immediately following town meeting, which is the point in time when they will have the bandwidth to actually make that happen. And then I think our job could be to think about that timeline and that work group being part of that timeline. So we keep this thing moving on the tracks and don't let it fall into the slow motion forward. Keep it moving.
Tucker, I think
So there a couple just quick comment. I mean, I agree with what Brooke was saying. The financials for it are driven by the uses that we end up determining going into it. So I think this meeting that Libby wants to organize is important ultimately to be producing the financials. I mean, we will have actually later this week, like, okay, what is a realistic scenario with respect to tax credit financing and so forth for a 30 unit project? Maybe not exactly the same, but like a notion of what realistically that might look like. So I think we're going to be able to talk intelligently to this topic, if necessary, in the context of these other articles as we go into town meeting. But I think this meeting that Libby wants to have next, I don't think that this issue is going to go cold between now and then. It's on her, her agenda, her radar screen. So I think that meeting is the important next step in then driving the timeline. And some of the other things that are happening concurrently may influence that timeline in terms of shy unit addition, for example. And, Richmond is applying for what effectively would be 2 years of safe harbor. The Nantucket Inn project has its own implications for what that might do for the SHI list. There are, there's sort of up and down indications from the appellants of Six Fairgrounds about resolving that. So all those things are going to factor into the elements we were just discussing.
great. So I think
Can I just have one quick comment?
very quick, because we're going to move on to the next item.
We're also going to have information from the data platform shortly, within a few months as that planning process starts to inform how we program that space. So I just want to throw that out.
So thank you, Brooke. On item number 9, moving to analysis of general fund discussion. This was an item put on.
I think
Yeah.
that this was continued from last meeting.
Yeah.
Where there was.
Yeah.
Yep.
I mean, this isn't an urgent thing for this particular meeting. The board, I thank the board at the last meeting for approving expenditures related to the Nantucket Inn analysis. Actually, I want to report some good news to the board that Mass Housing Partnership actually is underwriting the cost of the financial analysis of that. So to date, nothing has been committed to from what was approved at the last meeting, but maybe at the next meeting, we could talk in greater detail if we've got higher priorities for this meeting.
Okay, so we're good on the general fund aspect of that you wanted to touch
Let's
on?
just put it on the next meeting
Next
for
agenda,
discussion.
okay.
Thank you.
Great. Item number 10, the warrant article review that are related to affordable housing. Do we have a list of how we want to work through these? I guess just as they're written. So the first being Article 18. I'm going to recuse, step away from the table for this one. Let you guys carry that conversation if somebody wants to grab me when you're done.
So, okay. So Article 18 is the appropriation for the acquisition of the property at 1 to 3 Miller Lane, which is the Nantucket Inn. And what we wanted to do was just have a discussion about what the affordable housing Trust's role is, in terms of the warrant articles, my thought was, are we taking a position on anything as a board? Are we, how are we moving forward in terms of the warrant articles is sort of how I envisioned this conversation today. So, Tucker, you want to?
So I think, in the case of Article 18, the trust fund would, if this were something that were to be voted by town meeting and also approved at the ballot, the trust fund would be, to my understanding, the vehicle by which the Nantucket Inn acquisition, would happen. So I think it is important that the board is up to speed and maybe ultimately, does take some position. I will say that we go before the finance committee this Thursday, and so a financial presentation is, as Brooke noted earlier, well underway and being prepared for that. So I wouldn't necessarily actually expect the board to adopt a position today, absent having the chance to really, look at and understand that. But I guess I will generally say about this project or potential project is, I think financially, this is not the least expensive way to create housing. That said, it may be less expensive than, some other things that are being proposed this year. But it would be more than, say, the fire station example. I think a big part of the community's ultimate interest in the Nantucket Inn opportunity really rests on how it might value the other components of that property, most materially the front building, 24,000 square feet, facility that has no hotel rooms in it today, or doesn't necessarily immediately lend itself to housing the way that the hotel portion of the property does behind it. So, how the community, I think, views the value of that building, whether it be for, I've heard a wide range of ideas for it, but how we value that, I think, is going to be important in how we overall think about the opportunity.
Does anyone have any questions about that proposal as it is right now, given that we're going to have, more of a financial analysis on Thursday presented at FinCom? And
I know you're doing all manner of due diligence, or consults are doing due diligence. When is that kind of information? For example, what rehab costs there'd be to convert the current housing component into apartments?
Yeah, that's going to be part of this deck that's available for Thursday.
Okay.
Yeah.
Megan, did we post for FinCom on Thursday? Can we post for FinCom on Thursday? It's at 4.
I think it's at 4:00.
Yeah. I'm going to suggest that we post a meeting for FinCom so that all of us can be there if we want. And if we have a quorum, we'll open a meeting during that meeting. So I think a lot more information to come on Thursday. And then perhaps we would need to meet again, the timing of which.
You'll have presumably a March
We'll
regular
have a March
meeting. Yeah.
Right. So.
And if I apologize if I didn't mention earlier, but so the consultant working on this is Kevin McGuire, who is a developer and consultant in the state with tax credit experience. Actually, he was instrumental in helping the Sachem's Path project to go forward here. So he's very, familiar with Nantucket, and in conjunction with him, Susan Connolly of Mass Housing Partnership has been consulting on, the analysis of this as well. And as I mentioned earlier, MHP has underwritten the cost of doing this. So Kevin will be here on Thursday for the presentation, and I think it'll be a good discussion with the group.
So are the other members of the board comfortable with postponing any decision on this article to our next meeting?
Yeah, I'm fine with that.
All right. You want to grab Brian for us? Just wait for our chair to return. So Article 19 is obviously the related ballot measure. Okay. So
On to Article 32.
32.
So the CPC article and housing, does anybody want to expand on discussion here?
It's pretty straightforward. We went to the CPC, requested $1 million, and they included $750,000 in FY 2020 funding. As part of their general, they do it as a citizens warrant article for all of their allocations for the year. So I think this is more a reminder, informational. I'm not sure that it warrants any real discussion unless anyone has any questions.
Rima, Judith, Charity, any comment?
This doesn't include the bonding that they want to do. Okay, well then that's just regular.
Great and straightforward, right?
Yeah, normal stuff.
Awesome.
The bonding actually will, they voted to approve future allocations starting in fiscal 21
Okay.
to support the bonding. But my understanding from finance department is that money can be borrowed in anticipation of that on a short-term basis so that we would have access to the funds at the beginning of fiscal year 2020. But the CPC doesn't have to actually take it out of this year's funding article. It comes in 21.
So it would be an additional article for next April's town meeting?
So what they would do is they would
Tucker.
include the amount needed to support the bond issue in their 21 and going forward annual allocations, right?
Yeah, there's a separate article. I mean, Brooke's right. There's a separate article in this year's warrant related to this. And I think Brian Turbot just wanted the trust to be aware that even though the CPC article technically wouldn't impact their financials until 2021, he could go and borrow immediately. I think it's actually immediately following town meeting an affirmative vote.
Great. And that there's no wait for Attorney General or any aspect like that. It's literally.
Not to my knowledge, but
Okay.
yeah.
Great. So that moves us to page 16, Article 37. I'm sorry, was there any continued discussion there? Did anybody have any follow-up? No. So to Article 37, acquisition of existing properties for affordable housing purposes. This is the private citizen article from Tobias Glidden. To raise or bond up to $30 million for purchase of existing stock. This will be this will also be a ballot item. There was a presentation recently at FinCom that I believe Tucker attended and Brooke.
And this article actually will also be discussed at the same Thursday meeting this week with FinCom in greater detail than it was discussed at the prior meeting.
They presented some financials and then FinCom requested further details. So that's going to be on Thursday's meeting agenda as well.
Is there any feedback from that meeting that the rest of the board should hear that you think we want to share, or as far as the questions, or how's that board kind of?
I would say that the FinCom's request really was about making sure that the financials of that proposal are, how would I put this?
Realistic.
Realistic and if not generous in terms of making sure that the voters have a good sense of what the real cost of it would be, both from acquisition and ongoing management perspectives.
So it was management and maintenance was kind of
Exactly.
the after cost to the purchase that was really being considered.
Yes, and how the revenue stream would be estimated as well. And then, so that was really, that was really their primary feedback, is that they felt their role was to make sure that the voters were being presented with as much information and as accurate information to analyze this. And I think that they've basically said the same thing about the Nantucket Inn as well. So that's their request, and that's what they feel their role is.
Yeah, I
So,
would just add, I think the three things that I heard at the meeting with regard to that proposal were, one, to make sure that both the acquisition and the ongoing operation expense are realistic. Two, I think there was a concern expressed around the what would the restrictions need to be? Would they be in perpetuity? Would they have to be at 80%? And sort of, what is that doing effectively to the balance sheet of the town? So in essence, acquiring something, writing off a significant portion of it potentially out of the gate. And then the third element was, I believe one of the members had, expressed a question around effectively, would we be competing with people that in effect we're trying to help? Like, so if this article was was used and was acquiring properties that were cost effective in a sense to acquire, meaning at the lower end of the market, would a unintended consequence be properties that otherwise might be attainable to a certain portion of the year-round population would there be a competition going on there in effect? So some concern expressed about that.
Can you clarify for me the timeline on the restriction, the price, the AMA price point that the properties would need to be, and can we have varying AMI levels and have them still qualify for the SHI?
So, to the best of my knowledge, and this is an ongoing conversation with DHCD, but try to do it in order. They're proposing a rental program. So these would individually be put into, a rental program. So the rental rates would have to meet the DHCD limits based on the household or bedroom size of the individual property. My understanding from DHCD to date would be if you were acquiring a property that had one house on it, for example, that would have to be restricted at 80%, and it probably would have to be restricted in perpetuity, possibly for 30. We're trying to understand if it might be able to be limited to 30 years, but it's 30 years or more for sure. The other aspects in terms of if you were acquiring a property that might have 2 or 3 units on it, in that case, we could perhaps restrict 1 unit to the 80 and have the others at up to market rate, again, in a rental program, and still have them individually count on our SHI list. So I think that the proponents of the article originally sort of envisioned 24 separate site houses. I think for efficiency, now maybe, trying to target more where there are, like a house and a cottage, or even potential to do a tertiary apartment sort of thing. So getting a little bigger bang for the buck that way, and allowing for it not allowing for them all to have to be 80%.
Great. Thank you. Any continued discussion? Seeing none, we'll move on to Where are we?
Mass housing choice? Is that the end?
I have 38.
Oh, wait.
I have 38 highlighted on mine, but I don't know why. It's just a zoning change.
Yeah, I think that's end. That's an end.
Oh, that's the end of that. Okay, got it. Thank you.
Okay.
All right, so moving on.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Can I just say, I just wanted to add onto the last discussion. Yeah, again, the trust, if that article were to pass and it were to pass at the ballot, again, the trust would be the vehicle to administer that program. So I think it's important to think about for your next meeting, how you all view that article and what commentary you may want to make about it if asked at town meeting or leading up to town meeting or that type of thing.
On that point, I think one of the big questions that I'm hearing in the community and from the finance committee is the question of how would the properties be managed? And if it does end up falling under our scope of responsibility to administer this program, it's something we should all be thinking about and perhaps discuss, as Tucker said, further at the next meeting.
I just want to add, so I'm trying to understand a little bit more from the proponents about the intention of the article. And so, I kind of made up an example and said, well, this is obviously completely made up, but suppose, for instance, the proponents of the Surfside Crossing development woke up one morning and said, we're tired of being vilified or what have you, and we're going to go do something else. And there was an opportunity to acquire that property, perhaps in conjunction with the land bank. This is a made up example, but so I was asking one of the proponents, would you see this article, if it were to pass, as possibly being a funding source, if you will, for acquiring that property and doing something, that maybe was more palatable to the neighbors in the community? And the answer I got was no. Again, the intention of the article is to spread the locales of the housing around the island. And again, I think to a very great extent, be utilizing existing stock.
That being the case, I think it's important that we invite the proponents to the next meeting, that we look to them to identify what their vision is for the board. Not just in management, but what are the acquisition restraints that they want to identify and put on the article or put on a program that does get developed, and what level of participation for this program they want to have from the onset.
I think it's a great idea.
Yeah.
So I just had another recollection from that meeting. There was a finance committee member who raised the question, would they consider covenant, basically affordability buy downs on existing properties as well? So
that would fall into
and they indicated yes. So that's different from acquiring a property. It's acquiring a deed restriction into an affordable rental. So they are flexible in some regards with how this money might be spent, and obviously not in other regards. So I think to your point, having them come to our next meeting and give us a little more detail on it would be helpful.
Yeah, as we think about the buckets we spend from, it's important that we identify that bucket and what it can be spent on.
Mm-hmm. And I'd also love to see us really promote that meeting to the public as an opportunity to come and hear ahead of town meeting a discussion about that proposal. So now that we're in this space.
Okay, now hearing no more conversation related to that one. Moving on to item number 11, update on Mass Housing Choice Program. Tucker, just don't sit down.
Yeah, right. So very quickly, as the board is aware, last year Nantucket was designated in the initial class of housing choice communities as a housing choice community. That is a 2-year designation, so we don't need to reapply this year. It also avails us of the opportunity to apply for some special grant funding. The administration is in the process of finalizing how much grant funding will be available. The governor's requested $8 million. And so what that might end up translating into is grants up to anywhere between $250,000 to $500,000 toward housing related projects. And so in the way they have the program organized, if you can only receive a grant once every 2 years. So if you received a grant in the initial year, you're not eligible in the second year. We did not apply for a grant last year because really in part because we didn't feel we would be in a position to make a better case this year for a grant with respect to Waite Drive and Tacoma Way. So Tacoma Green, excuse me. The intention is to apply in the spring. The criteria will be coming out in the spring for the grant applications, but recently attended a presentation by the director of the Housing Choice Program, and it sounds like the manner in which they're revising the criteria actually may score us some extra points in the evaluation process. So there's nothing for the board to do at this time. The grant application, a lot of what will go into it will really actually come from the DPW, most likely. But I'll keep you apprised as we learn about what the criteria are.
Brooke, did you have a comment?
No, I was going to ask who the applicant would be.
It's the town. Yeah.
So not us.
No.
necessarily.
Yeah.
Okay.
And when's the grant application due?
The criteria are going to be issued around April 1st, and the application will likely be due in May. So it's just like a 6-week window. It's a short window.
The fire station project might be an interesting one to look for funding for too.
I think that's where we want to see the criteria and where you score the extra points and put the project that fits the best. Yep.
Any other commentary? Hearing none, we'll move on to short-term rental tax update, request for allocation for housing.
Status report.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. The one we've been waiting on the longest.
No.
So item number 12, the status report on the strategic plan. Everyone has a printed copy in front of them of a strategic plan that went around last night. It looks like at 3 a.m. So I expect nobody had the opportunity to review it.
That's right.
I did actually. And I can say that my initial feedback is the use of the word Board of Selectmen instead of Select Board needs to be amended, and the charts are fuzzy still. So I would say as anyone has any further feedback, I'll hold comment back to Judy until I hear folks have a chance to review it. And
so in a hope that this doesn't take another month for conversation, can we as a board look to independently supply Megan comments? Today's Tuesday, by Friday? Is that fair for everybody?
I'm gonna be away until like Tuesday, so I won't see anything else till
Okay,
you want to stretch it out.
so let's say Wednesday next week. And would you please email the attachment and to the other board members that aren't here? And so we'll look for next Wednesday in hopes that we can get a final in advance of the next meeting so it can be reviewed, discussed, and voted on.
not for lack of trying.
I understand. I've seen all the emails.
Just a question, Mr. Chair. I think,
Yeah.
as you know, there are some members of the public who have inquired about the status of the report. And so in terms of disseminating anything publicly, if you will, I mean, in a sense, it's already a public document. I mean, is it okay to share a copy of this draft and note to those individuals who requested it that it is still a draft, or what would you like to do?
Can it be immediately watermarked that says draft on it and then disseminated?
Sure, we could put that on there for
Yeah.
sure. Yeah.
If you, I see no reason not to do that.
Yeah,
I
okay,
agree.
great. Thank you.
Okay, now on to item 13. I'm sorry. Did anybody have any wrap up on that? No. On to item 13, short-term rental tax, request for allocation for housing. So those of you who may or may not have followed the short-term, we'll call it the Airbnb rental tax, there was a lot of discussion. Basically, the state has imposed a tax that could be greater than 11%. Right now in our community, the hotels, bed and breakfasts pay 11.7%. There was some discussion at the Board of Selectmen about reducing the town's portion from 6% to 4%. There has been a decision to maintain it at 6% for the first year. There is some kind of funding estimates from the finance office. I think Brian was in the mid 2 million range as far as overall allocation for the 2.5 million, for the 6% that the town would collect. 5.7% goes to the state, 6 would come to the community. If I'm correct, I think they're going to be putting it into the general fund in the first year. There were members of this board, also Tucker, who attended the Board of Selectmen meetings. I think there is a hope that this could become a consistent revenue source for affordable housing on Nantucket, whether it was all or some portion of it on a regular basis. I put this on so we could have a discussion about it. I think as early as possible, we should put forth a position to the Board of Selectmen from this group. So that's why I put it on. So I open the floor to discussion. Judith?
The legislation itself seemed to flag or call out affordable housing as a use and infrastructure as a use. I haven't gone back to read it again, but that would be incredibly disappointing to have it disappear into the general fund, particularly if we were to say this really should be for housing, because you can really see the nexus, the effect of summer rentals, making it harder for people to have year-round housing, for one thing. For another thing, it just seems to me to be our hope, but I think in a pretty slim hope maybe about the tax. I know Julian Sear has that in his omnibus bill, but the purchaser tax to
Transfer fee?
yeah. So you could say to them something like, until the transfer fee comes on, this should be allocated for this purpose, and it's really closely connected. It's a logical thing. It seems really an imperative to me.
Yeah.
My understanding is, as it stands, the current methodology for allocating is a stabilization fund, right? One current methodology for allocating for housing.
Well, that is a vehicle that they could utilize. I'd recommend in your letter. I mean, I heartily endorse sending a letter, and but I would. The challenge with the stabilization fund is you need a 2/3 vote of town meeting to get any money out of a stabilization fund. I mean, I think this group is already ideally set up with the $100,000 threshold it has, with needing select board approval for a check and balance.
Mm-hmm. I concur. However, my understanding is a stabilization fund locks up the funds better than, say, an annual allocation of the revenue to the Affordable Housing Trust. So it's really a question of the vehicle. I think we can learn more about it, but I definitely think we should make our position to the select board that a portion of this revenue stream be set aside for affordable housing to come to the Affordable Housing Trust.
There was some discussion originally as well that if Board of Selectmen reducing the tax to 4%, and so that the 6% may only exist for 1 year in a see how it goes scenario. So if it does get reduced in the future, we should look to some longer term percentage now. And to Judith's point, if there was a future transfer fee, we could move away from it or reduce it, or, come back to the table at that conversation. But I would encourage the board to authorize sending a letter to the Board of Selectmen for some percentage of that 6% to be used for affordable housing.
Could somebody explain a little more the stabilization fund terminology, what the significance of that is?
I really can't, but my in observation of the meetings, and Brian Turbert from FinCom, he was discussing the various ways that the money would be allocated and used, whether it was for municipal DPW projects or now we have Rita coming in, so maybe she would be the expert on that conversation.
Let her sit
Sorry to
down
put you on the
first.
spot.
So I'm gonna hit that guy.
Okay. So what we were just talking about, Rita, was the short-term rental tax. And the concept of this board sending a letter to the Board of Selectmen that they would like to see some percentage of the 6% flow through here to be used for housing and identifying our interest. There's some conversation on how the town's going to allocate that money. Would it be general fund, stabilization fund? I think some of us are unclear on what's the best way for those funds for this board to work with them in a flexibility sense. Tucker did point out that we're set up well for it at this point with the checks and balances of the 100,000 to the Board of Selectmen.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we identify some topics?
My understanding, but I think it's being updated all the time, is that the way to allocate it and keep out of the general fund would be a stabilization fund. I'm not sure if it went to the general fund exactly how we can make sure that it comes here other than an annual commitment to an allocation, but it wouldn't be as sort of untouchable as the stabilization fund. The stabilization fund, I don't fully understand how long it takes to get things out. And it sounds like it's definitely a little more difficult to access. And I think that could have some pros and cons, but I haven't looked at it myself yet. I do know that Martha's Vineyard is essentially creating a stabilization fund for affordable housing with their short-term rental tax. So I don't know, Tucker, if you've been keeping up to date on that, but I think that the model that, from what I've read, the model that they have could be one that would really work for us if we decided that the stabilization fund was the way to go. I think from some of the conversations on the board, the select board, it does sound like there would be some at least initial interest in the stabilization fund route to make sure that it goes to affordable housing.
And I also want to point out, I believe Julian Sears' omnibus housing bill, as I'm referring to it, has one proposal in it that includes making an exception for the vote on stabilization funds and making it a regular majority, not a 2/3 vote for housing, for housing stabilization funds in particular.
Is that to create the fund, or is that once there's money in it?
It's a change so that it wouldn't require 2/3. It would only require 50% vote. Yeah. I think it's one of his proposals
To withdraw money or
to take the money out. So
it's one of the things that he talked about looking at or incorporating into his bill. I don't know for certain if it's part of the bill as presently proposed, but Rita, I don't know if the board has talked about it in looking at the stabilization fund, but for example, like, can bonding be done with funds out of the stabilization fund?
We really haven't gotten into the detail of that yet. I think the board's focus really has been more on is it going up or down, with a general sentiment being that we would like to see a dedicated amount going to affordable housing, but we really haven't gotten into the details. So
and I don't know the answer either, but that's one of the things I'd want to understand.
I feel like it's an opportunity again for this board to put some suggestions to the select board, because again, we haven't gotten into the details. And I think there's a lot of, I guess everyone's a little bit unsure exactly how much money we're talking about this year. So I think that might be part of the reason why we haven't started talking details, but I think we here could probably make some suggestions if we wanted to. I think that would be a good route to take.
I think the based on some of the estimates that I've seen, we're probably in the 2.5 million range. 2% puts that at 825,000. So I think that we should put forth those suggestions
Yeah.
in a letter formally to the Board of Selectmen from this group and
Mhm.
and start this conversation, in the near term.
So I'd be willing to agree to do some research with the finance department on this whole question of stabilization funds. And because I think there's two questions. I think that there's a request for a portion, some portion of that revenue.
Mhm.
And then there's the question of what vehicle, how does the money flow?
Yeah.
By what vehicle? So I think it's a two-part question. And I think we should all think about, I'll get some numbers in terms of, refining. The other thing that's interesting about this year is that no contracts signed prior to January 1st are subject to the tax this year. So
Right.
everyone who signed their lease before January 1st doesn't have to pay that. Those will not generate revenue this year. So
And-
this year's sort of like a half start.
And leases before July 1st. So there's 20% of the inventory that rents before July 1st that won't be allocated in this year. And any of the July, August, September leases that were written before January 1st
Yeah.
won't be allocated in this year. So whatever this year's number is will be very different than next year's number.
And the 2.5 million is the next year's number estimate.
I think that was the original estimates that Brian had kind of put together from
For a full
Yeah.
year.
like the 1,400 houses,
Yeah.
6
Yeah.
weeks,
Kind
a
of his
year.
refined
Yeah.
version. I would like to know more about, and it might be a discussion that we have to have, but if it was, say, 100,000 a year coming from the short-term rental tax, how do we envision using that? And is having it in a stabilization fund where it needs a town meeting vote going to meet our needs?
Absolutely.
Everything so far has been a discussion about being able to move quickly. So if, maybe this is an addition to the funds that we have that allow us to move quickly. So then what sort of uses are we envisioning for money that will be a little bit slower?
Go ahead.
Comment. I don't know Massachusetts rules about how funds are allocated or held, but it sounds to me like a stabilization fund is like at least a quasi endowment that you're having to put it aside and then have oversight to expend it. And that, as you say, seems really contrary to what we're trying to do. And it means you're going to have to go back and get approval every time, either by special town meeting or annual town meeting. So I wonder whether there's ways to get the town to basically create what I think of as a sinking fund. Like if you're going to buy a big fire truck, you gradually put money, it's like a savings account, so that if it were put into that kind, to create like a trust corpus that you then can draw off of, or in some instances, depending on how you do it, once you've hit a certain point, you've got a backup amount and then you could spend going forward off of that. So I'd want to know if there's some other choice other than stabilization fund and other than having to have yearly appropriations. I know there may be constraints that you can't appropriate against the future in a way that would bind a future board up to a point. But if you have the intent to start creating that it's like a bonding arrangement, except you're kind of bonding yourself. You're filling in an account so that you've got the assets to then act upon. So I would just urge to press into maybe things that haven't typically been done here before, or I wonder, say, if we had a formal trust account that was called a trust account, if there could be a designation that this money flows every year into a trust account that is dedicated here, with the understanding that we can't take out of it without approval with the board. But it just seems like a stabilization fund. I don't know what Martha's Vineyard, if they're doing it, maybe they've looked at all the options and that's the only option, but it seems pretty constraining to me that like to think there's some other way to do it.
Yeah, and I can talk to Philippe Jordy, who I think has kind of been at the center of organizing that over there. And that may, if they're going the stabilization fund route, it may be partly due to the nature of Martha's Vineyard
Right.
being 5 different towns,
Different towns,
versus
right.
us being one.
Right.
And so, but I agree with what you were saying there, Judith. I think that, I mean, I personally think that the board, it would be good to consider sending a letter. I would say requesting that 50% or more of the revenue generated from the short-term tax go toward this, to allow the select board some latitude. I mean, the two issues obviously that have repeatedly come up in conjunction with the bill at the state level have been, clean water or water quality and housing. So, perhaps it should be divided down the middle, but something along those lines. And I think we can get a little more information from the finance department. I don't know, like, in what detail, like, this is money that we don't collect
goes.
locally. It's collected by the state and then sent back to us. So Brian Turbot may be able to give us more insight into, like, the reporting that he will be getting in terms of this revenue, and the ability to specifically identify that, this was our short-term hotel occupancy revenue, and this is the short-term rental revenue as we all think of it. And then therefore it may be a fairly straightforward exercise to be able to allocate a certain portion. And there is a trust account. And again, I would reiterate, I strongly would be in favor of it going to the trust account versus a stabilization fund, for the reasons that you all just have talked about.
Another thing that occurs to me is there's probably, the vineyard, you can talk to Philippe, but it seems to me, rather than be hamstrung by what the existing categories are, you could go back to our legislators and say, because of the unique circumstances here, can you get authorization not just to reduce the vote for a stabilization fund, but to create an appropriate entity? And it seems to me like the vineyard, if they have the equivalent of us, that seems like a better solution about how, as long as you've got good financial controls in place and oversight in place. I can see that the town may not feel like they want to commit to doing that forever, but I think equally important with the amount and the duration is the mechanism, or else it's going to go to waste. If it's too cumbersome, you can see we have a stabilization fund. It takes 2/3 of town meeting. We never get a quorum at town meeting. So it'll keep growing and nobody can use it. That seems like a pretty unfortunate turn of events.
Exactly. And I think the town and the select board actually have more flexibility utilizing the body and the accounts as they exist, that it can get adjusted, in any given year going forward.
Rita, you had some comment.
Yeah, I also think that there is a couple other board members have mentioned that once you create a stabilization fund, it is difficult to get rid of it if you ever did want to change it, if there was a better mechanism. And I feel like something along the lines of a research and review, and then a recommendation to the select board about the options, and then our recommendation based on that, and with Brian Turbot, and find out what we can.
I'd love to get us to a place where we're presenting a letter sooner than later with some percentage that we're asking for. It's obvious that it's going to be a 24-month cycle at minimum to understand what the revenue created is based on the time that the tax came out, et cetera. If we could we have a letter for next meeting to look at, with the understanding that we're going to do some research with Brian? I think Brooke, you mentioned, and while maybe not this board determining what the best sort of setup for the funding is, but kind of bringing it back to the finance department.
Yeah. So yes, we can have a letter, and yes, that's what I was going to recommend. Not that we try to prescribe the mechanism, but maybe we bring up the concerns we are aware of associated with different mechanisms.
I mean, I think that's in line with us, taking a leadership role around funding housing questions, and helping the select board, partnering and providing as much information as we can to
Yeah.
them in terms of what we think would work well, given our goals. So that makes a lot of sense. So, I mean, I'm happy to take that on, and I think at a minimum, a request for some portion of the funding in an initial letter with a promise of more information to come
Yeah,
later,
that's
or
good.
if I can generate that information and we feel comfortable making comments or recommendations in that letter, but we would approve it at the next meeting if that makes sense.
I'd just say 50%, or I'd go back to the legislation that enacted the bill and see exactly take that language from it, because it does specify housing
Mhm.
and infrastructure, I believe. And if there's a third, split it 3-3-3. But
As I remembered, it said something like 35% needs to be either to affordable housing or infrastructure or both, and then it is silent about what the balance is. So I think the best you can probably say is it targets affordable housing specifically, and that's therefore was on their mind, and it's on the community's mind, obviously. So.
Right.
When we're talking about 50% as well, though, because a portion of the short-term rental taxes that the hotels and inns are already paying, that's going towards
Currently,
culture and the Department of Culture, I believe, and tourism. I think almost all of it is going there. So when we're talking about 50%, how does that $2.5 million line up with? I don't remember the numbers off my head, but when we're talking about the money that we're already getting in to short-term rental tax plus the additional.
Mike, and looking back into my mind's eye of looking at the paperwork, I think it's going to be about the same.
It's about the same. So
I think so, based on some of the projections. I think it was close. So was it $3.5 million that
We currently bring in roughly 3.5 on the existing occupancy tax.
right, and then cycling through 24 months to grouping all of the potential leases in should be for homes should be near matching that.
okay, and that's the 50%.
Well, no, I
that
think
we're
we would be
talking
looking at 50% of the 50%, right? Not
Okay,
touching the
yeah.
existing tourism, but 50% of the newly created short-term
Term
house
rental.
rentals, not inclusive of
The current.
the current usage.
Yeah.
Would be my thought. But
That's what- yeah.
this is a discussion for the board.
That's what I was thinking. I just wanted to clarify for myself, and then I think again, just making sure that that's clear
specific,
if anyone
yeah.
asks.
Right.
That's the 50% we're talking about.
Right. And I think that was part of the concern brought up by Brian, is that some of the funding is already spent. And if you don't match it, there'd be a shortfall of.
Right.
Yeah, and that was my understanding of the intent of the board. 50% on the new revenue.
Great. So in saying that we can have a letter for next week or next month, is that something that you're taking on behalf
Yeah.
of this board?
Yeah,
Okay.
I'll prepare a draft and for sure.
Great. Thank you very much. Any more on that item? Hearing none, moving on to the Mass legislative update. Who would like to take the lead on this? Brooke?
Well, do you
Tucker?
want to talk about our meeting, or you want to?
I mean, just briefly, in Brooke or I and Brian was at the meeting as well. Can answer questions, but Senator Sear and Representative Fernandez were here about 10 days or so ago. We had an opportunity to discuss the legislative aspects in terms of the housing bank bill, what might come next with regard to that, as well as other legislative efforts. And of course, Senator Sear, I think, was very encouraging of utilizing a portion of short-term rental taxes you all were just talking about. I think he recognizes, it's going to take, even if the housing bank bill passed tomorrow, that's not going to be our complete and total answer. So I think he strongly encourages the community to look at sort of multiple resources for addressing the issue, but specifically on the housing bank bill. I'm going to say, actually, Senator Sear was very engaged, the most engaged that he's been to date. It's obviously been on the House side. Dylan Fernandez has worked very hard to get it to where it is. As we all know, it's kind of gotten stuck on the Speaker of the House's desk. The Speaker being unwilling to take on the Mass Association of Realtors and move it forward. thus far. What I think excited Senator Sear is that actually in the governor's budget, he is suggesting using a very similar transfer fee for funding climate change initiatives in his program. And so I think Senator Sear feels, well, like if this is an appropriate funding mechanism for important priorities, then why not the Nantucket housing bill? So I think they're planning to adopt a multi-pronged strategy to both pushing our bill forward, which has been refiled, as well. I guess you could say the cat is out of the bag with respect to other communities looking at what we originally proposed. And you now have several communities that have proposed similar measures. And so I think the next step is they're going to be putting together a statewide version of our bill to put before the legislature.
Thank you, Tucker.
And also, everyone should read Senator Sear's bill. Meg, do we send that out? Do we send the link to that out? So I'll get it to Megan. I mean, he has a sort of a comprehensive bill that has, as he put it, he's thrown a whole lot of different proposals from zoning to revenue to literally everything related to housing, a piece of which I think is this, stabilization fund adjustment and so on the vote. And his strategy is, as he put it, I think, is to throw everything against the wall and see what sticks, and also to partner with different communities with whom the Cape and Islands have common interests, and for which parts of these strategies or components of this bill work in different areas in the state, and try to build legislative support for different parts of it and see what sticks and moves forward. So I'll make sure everybody gets a link to that. It's a very comprehensive bill, and it's in a lot of different arenas. And so it's definitely on his radar to promote housing for the Cape and Islands region in particular, and then wherever it works to work with across the state. So great. Look forward to reading it. It's a good one.
Excellent, thank you. Item number 15, the implementation plan. So to come back to where we had left off previously, this is back on the agenda just to keep our ball moving forward on some of the topics that were discussed. If there's any update for...
So I included the entire outline, largely because I had, as promised a couple meetings ago, I kind of reorganized it to add some sort of subheadings so that I thought it would be clear to us so we have this sort of long operations piece that we talked about in detail at our last meeting, and then our 2 meetings ago. And then I sort of split the other initiatives into new unit development and other programs to add shy list units. So just to sort of categorize our initiatives going forward, and they end up sort of in the same order that they were in. But I don't know how anybody feels about that, but I thought I'd get feedback. And I mean, I think the good news is that we're really moving forward on a lot of these initiatives already. New unit development, which is on the second page, evaluation of this fire station property, and the select board's voted to move forward with that. We can continue to look at other viable town-owned properties for development. And I think collaboration with the select board and town administration.
Just a quick update on that, and I apologize. Tucker and I spent a little time with Andrew looking at the town maps of available properties that had potential, and the list is very short. It's a handful of potential properties at most. One in town, I think on York Street. There was the fire station property. There's the properties that exist here on the fairgrounds complex. But outside of that, it is a very, very small list based on encumbrances of wetlands or FAA or various different potential restrictions. I think there was one in Surfside to be discussed. So we will work at putting together the address list and bring that to the.
Any idea? I know you said it's a short list, but any idea, general estimate on how many?
Like 6. Oh, units would be a different conversation. For example, like the fire station property has a high potential on it, but the other lots in their zoning, they were residentially zoned, so it would be no more than 3, one being a tertiary under 650. I think I'm pretty close on that.
One thing the board might want to consider is so with respect to Surfside, I think there actually are 1 or 2 lots out there that the town owns that in theory, housing could be developed on, but it might lend themselves better to sale. And I believe there already has been like town meeting authority granted for doing such a thing. I think each of the parcels is $1 million plus parcel as a piece of land and generating revenue, that could then be utilized for a development or land acquisition in a more suitable location. Anyway, I'm just wondering if the board wants to consider like another type of letter to the select board with respect to something along those lines.
Well, I'd love Megan to put it on the next agenda item, and let's bring the addresses of those properties, a quick analysis of each one. Is it residential? Is it commercial?
Yeah.
And then we can discuss putting a letter together for highest and best use in this board's opinion.
Yeah.
Great. Sorry, back to you, Brooke.
No,
Thanks.
that's okay, because what I was going to say is the next item, collaborate with the select board and town administration typos on overall land use plans. I mean, I think that speaks to there is property here adjacent to the fire station, the Plus building that could be used for housing, but does it have better use for municipal office space? And I think that collaboration on the longer term plan for town properties is important as we talk about, potential for housing as well as other things. And are there swaps? Are there existing town office buildings that would be better purpose for housing and vice versa? So I think that's a larger conversation that we need to continue to have with town administration and the select board. Yeah. So, and then we had on the list, develop policy for use of housing trust funds for infrastructure to facilitate housing. I think that also comes into the conversation, like what are we doing at the fire station? And is there infrastructure work that needs to be done that, and so that's a future conversation. And then we've also moved forward. We are moving forward. We did the RFIs for the purchase of land. And so we are moving forward in that regard in terms of that priority. And then
Is that should be 2019 instead of 18 on your date?
Yes, that needs to be updated. That line. Sorry about that. And also 2B seems to have lost some language as well. I think it's coordinate with the finance department is that whole line. We haven't done anything particular in terms of pursuing partnerships with Land Bank. I did have a chat with Jesse Bell of the Land Bank about getting together and starting that conversation about how we might work more closely together. Mm-hmm. So that's on the. So to my mind, sort of the next. And then there's the develop criteria partnership with private developers. I mean, that's a little bit down the road, I think. And then as the fire station property develops and so on and so forth. And then I think, the next big thing we need to move on to is we requested funding and we've been granted as part of our CPC allocation this year. One of the things we wanted to do was look into and develop a down payment assistance program. So I think that needs to be probably on our agenda for an upcoming meeting soon to start that process. And then again, you know, these we're in priority order based on earlier discussions. How do we create a rental subsidy program? And there is a lot of conversation in the community about that, as I'm seeing on social media. People interested in figuring out how to incentivize landlords to rent affordably. And
Great. You're
and
seeing activity on social media about that?
yeah, I'm
Great.
hearing discussion about the Airbnb, the short-term rental tax and the impact on seasonal renters. And, you know, is there a financial incentive or some kind of incentive out there to encourage people who are renting on a seasonal basis to bring their properties into year-round rental program? And then therefore, you know, our role in it would be if it were an affordable rental program, and what's the financial puzzle, what pieces of the puzzle, what contribution would incentivize someone to commit to a year-round rental and B, affordable year-round rental.
There's something else that it's great to hear that there's more conversation going on around that. This is a totally unvetted and thought out idea, but I was just thinking about it the other day. Part of the problem with the Nantucket Shuffle is just the unknown every year. And I was thinking about the people that I know that are renting out short-term Airbnbs. I don't see them turning it into year-round because it's an extra bedroom on the house. It's a shared kitchen. It's a shared bathroom. But I was just starting to think about, is there a way to, for the people that there might always be people doing the Nantucket Shuffle, or until we figure this out in a couple of years. But is there a way to incentivize a long-term, short-term? As in, you get kicked out of your housing every year in June, and someone who's been renting weekly for July and August, would they be up for being a gap for the Nantucket Shuffle? So that, say, for example, I got kicked out. I didn't know where I was going to go. You can never find anywhere, but I always knew that these people would rent their spots to a year-rounder for 2 months. Then I wouldn't have to worry as much with the Nantucket Shuffle. So that was, again, not thoroughly thought out, but I'm just wondering if there's another little niche for people who are doing Airbnb on a weekly basis, but incentivizing not a year-round rental, because I think it would be too invasive year-round or too much of a burden on the family units, thinking of the people that I know, but they might consider helping someone sort of mitigate the Nantucket Shuffle, not end it. So just sort of throwing that out there. But yeah, I think there's a couple different layers to the conversation still. So food for thought.
And I think we're talking about two different markets too. We're talking about like rooms in someone's home versus separate apartments and dwellings as well.
Yeah.
And yeah, so.
Yeah, again, it's just having done the Nantucket Shuffle myself, just knowing that every year in and around May, June, when you know you're going to get kicked out, the anxiety and the places that you end up, even it's not going to help everyone because there's so many people doing that. But if there were a couple people, again, that rather than doing Airbnb, there was some sort of incentive to provide basically stable 2-month housing that you could go to every year. That would be interesting.
Tucker?
Yeah, I think that would be a really good thing to investigate alongside the down payment assistance program, because I think we're going to find the down payment assistance, in order to have effect, is going to take like a very large number in an individual basis. And I think there are definitely people who might ask the question, like, is that, is helping just a very small handful of people really the best use of taxpayer dollars, versus if we're like incentivizing a broader population with rental properties to, where we may be helping dozens of people. Anyway, I think it would be useful to be looking at both as we consider.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to track that as well, side by side with down payment. I think that's interesting.
Present them as alternatives to each other in a way, in terms of what you get for your dollars.
So along that note, would we, with having had such success bringing in the the Union Studio, is this the kind of conversation that we may want to come back and look at the budgeting, bring in some consultancy? I don't know that we necessarily have the depth of staff at the moment to really dive into providing us a group of kind of programmatic concepts. Is this something we may want to start that process and allocate some funding for this coming year to kind of move that ball forward?
I mean, I think it's worth thinking about a little bit. I don't know if it should be an agenda item. I guess maybe even if I just wrote down what I was thinking and threw it out there for more discussion. But yeah,
whether it was this solely or in conjunction with a down payment assistance, like to get us to the table to a place where we can vote on a down payment assistance program and or a covenant buy down program, and with the other scope and projects that we have going to get us to a place to move the ball further along. Should we be looking to an independent housing group to come in and consult with our needs, bringing this into our I'm looking at the second line of overall trust operations monthly budget reporting. Is this something we want to allocate some funding and work through May, June, July with another group? I know that we have limited resources available to us. We just had great success bringing somebody in. Is this a way to move us further down the line as we talk about some of these items?
Sorry, incentivizing rental.
Whether it's incentivizing rentals, down payment assistance program, like how do we get? We've talked about these things for a lot of time. A lot of the time, how do we get there? How do we get there? We don't have a staff with enough depth in time and resources to be able to provide us those plans. So I guess my question is, do we want to move this along and get a couple of programs in front of us? Is my thought.
Yeah.
Yes, Brooke.
Is that something MHP might help us with?
I was going to say yes, exactly. Like that's the type of thing I think if we can articulate some of, like as Rita was saying, putting down some of the things that we're thinking about, they're in a great position to be aware of other programs that are happening around the state, some of the maybe even special considerations that would come into play here. That I might recommend that as the place to start. And they may well say, oh, and maybe this is the person to engage, and oh, maybe we might pay for that too. So
this would really fall into a number of the items that are on the list. And do we bring somebody in to help work on the second half of this implementation plan to kind of,
Yes.
like, I'd love to have a printed book of 5 programs by the end of 12 months from now. And I recognize a volunteer board may not be the group to have it fully documented and vetted. So how do we move that along?
That idea.
I would, yes. And if MHTP is the first stop, but I think, yes, I would be absolutely for that.
So is that a conversation, Tucker, that you can initiate with them and include us? So coming back to the next meeting, we can see what their bandwidth is, their kind of opportunity costs, just to.
So I can draft an email that I would send to Susan and Laura, and maybe have you look at it before it goes, so make sure it's encapsulating what you all are thinking about.
Yeah.
Great.
And I think I love the idea of sort of lumping these all together into one plan or one request for details, because the idea it's hard to prioritize them when you don't know what they're going to cost, right? In terms of what their cost effectiveness is. And so the idea that we could hire someone to flesh out all of these, present us with numbers, and then we can analyze them and make recommendations on which ones we want to move forward with. I love that idea, and I'm happy to work with you with MHP. And then I think for me, the question is, we've all been thinking about this a lot, and I'm sure each of us individually has sort of things that we don't know or we would want to know about each of these ideas. And that's probably what we need to bring to MHP. Like, what do we envision what do you envision a down payment program would look like? What do I envision it? so that we can sort of steer them in the right direction in
Mhm.
terms of gathering information for us
Yeah.
or providing someone to gather the information.
If we did engage them, I would see a workshop here with
Yeah.
them to be able to kind of work through that in an open table discussion where we could really kind of hash out, get them familiar with our needs as a community and what how the shuffle works and what the covenant looks like.
I was just thinking too, with the data platform data coming in, that it could well be important in how we move ahead, because it may give us more insights, and that we're going to get something. You were just want to circle back that some of that's coming in when prior to town meeting or after. I know we got a slower start than we'd hoped, but
Correct. So we expect to have some preliminary feedback on use case 1 and some information on the how the process is being set up for use case 2 for town meeting. And then the whole thing is due in June.
thanks.
And we still don't have a signed contract, just so you know. But they're moving ahead anyway.
Well, that's very nice of them. So, any more on the
No, I mean, I think yeah, this is exactly where we need to go. So I'm
Okay,
good with
great.
that.
Would you list excuse me, 1/2 second, as an agenda item, kind of a MHP review for next meeting? Rima, yes.
So there is a RFI criteria developed. We have an RFI somewhere.
We did it 2 meetings ago, right?
Did we?
For land acquisition, we sent it off to the finance department.
Okay, I don't remember.
So there were 3 different RFIs that we discussed at that time, and one was basically a blanket open letter of interest if you have developed property, houses on it that you'd be interested in sell. Then undeveloped property is a completely separate one. And then the third was, would you be interested in creating a covenant lot, yet may not have the resources to do it, and then come here? So,
Okay.
we would need to create a program if that comes back with some interest, but could we be paying for the engineering expenses and the title expenses for somebody and then to create covenant lots?
Yeah, so that's like sort of like a buy down or just a covenant assist.
It'd basically be a covenant assist on the opportunity, right? We could pay the fund back, the trust back. Like somebody might not have the upfront money to do it. If they then sold the lot, they could pay the trust back the upfront money for doing the work, and then the lot gets created. So whether they sold their market or their covenant.
Okay, all right.
That was kind of the idea on that. And then are there any individual, the first 2 RFIs were what could, in anticipation of Tobias's article, what existing houses might be out there that we could get engaged in conversation prior to. And then for the land acquisition funding that we've requested, what land exists?
So those Tucker drafted and sent to finance, but that hasn't appeared in real time yet. We're not currently recruiting under those RFIs, are we?
Well, it's an RFI. It's just sort of, would you be interested?
But is
But
it
they
out?
haven't been published.
They haven't been published or distributed or anything, have they?
Not to my knowledge. I can tell.
That'd be great if we could, knew the timeline and saw the final versions get circulated, what's going out. Because I think that's an opportunity for us to market those as well. When we talk about community outreach and how do we market them.
Well, and it's probably important. I know the press before town meeting that you talked about before, but before the summer hits and everything. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Were any other items in here that somebody, Rima, thank you for catching that. Anybody want to grab onto or chat about while we're here? Hearing none, we'll close that item for today. Budget review, I don't see it in the packet.
For the next meeting, we'll have I'm working on a dashboard basically that I want to have an updated format to how we are looking at the financial information. Rita had mentioned a form that the finance department uses, and
Great.
that's
Awesome.
our next meeting.
Thank you. Are there any board comments? Judith?
Oh, go ahead.
I just wanted to say thank you again for the fire station presentation. That was really well done. And my biggest concern at the time when it came up was that it would distract us from our plan. So thank you to Tucker and to whomever else was involved in making that happen without distracting us. So
I wanted to just ask to try to keep these cemented in my mind. Where are we on things in the pipeline to get on the shy list? Like Richmond is supposedly having some come ahead in this month, and what other things are close to moving?
Right.
There.
Sure. Thank you. So technically, we are at 121 units on our SHI list. We're required to be at 490 in terms of the 10% figure. There are 22 units that have been applied for to be added, and I think for all intents and purposes could be considered to be added to our list. They don't publish the list every year, but we've provided all of the documentation that last fall that is associated with including those 22 on the list. And
Where are those 22 coming from?
so they come from different places. 10 of the units are actually Sachem's Path, the 80% units in Sachem's Path. That project, I think maybe it was because of the timeline, but those units weren't added. They may have actually been added initially and then fallen off because it took a while to build out. But they can be added again. I think it's important to kind of keep a couple things in mind. Again, 24 is a magic number for Nantucket in terms of safe harbor. We have to create 24 units in a year in order to get safe harbor. Create doesn't necessarily mean build and occupy. I can, elaborate on that if folks would like. But I guess the point is, if someone were to hear, oh my gosh, like 22 units, like if we had just a couple more, could that have provided safe harbor for us last year, type of thing? The answer is no. The Sachem's Path, it always goes back to whenever you actually add them to the list, it always goes back to the point at which they were first eligible. So Sachem's Path, those units were first eligible to be added in 2012. So we're going to get credit for 10 units on our shy list, sort of effective in 2012. So they absolutely count toward our 490 goal, but they wouldn't count in the current year for safe harbor. I just want to explain that. So 7 units are related to Beach Plum Village. 1 unit is related to the Housing Nantucket building at 18 Tacoma, and probably shortly that second building will be eligible to also be added. So that's 18 of the units. There are 4 more units associated with 7 Surfside, another Housing Nantucket project that you all are aware of in terms of helping facilitate getting those onto the list. And again, we haven't received the official word, but it would appear that there's not a question of those being added as well. So that's 22 units in the process of being added. Richmond has applied. We've sent in the LAU applications for all 3 components of their project, Sandpiper 1 and 2 and Meadows 2. And so DHED is actively reviewing those applications. They came back with some questions, requests for additional materials, information. Those had been responded to. So the anticipation, I guess you could say, is that barring something unforeseen, that sometime in March we might get approval from DHCD with regard to that application. That doesn't mean they immediately go on the SHI list. In the Richmond case, because of where the project is relative to the original permit issuance, they need to pull their building permits in order for the town to then get the credit for the SHI units. And so Richmond is, I think in the recent MOA with Richmond, basically they've committed to pulling at building permits for at least 48 units in the rental program, their 225 rental program, which would in effect give us 2 years of safe harbor.
When you say they've committed to that being the first thing that they pull a permit for?
Correct.
Or? Okay.
Yeah. So, and they have to do that within a certain time frame relative to the approval of other things in the pipeline here, in association with their project.
So perfect world, we're looking May, June, if they get
If everything
DHCD
played
by
out under a
March.
reasonable timeline, we might expect to have 2 years of safe harbor from the Richmond project. Yes, in the May timeframe. So then Six Fairgrounds still under appeal. There had been some overtures from the appellants about potentially settling the lawsuit. And thus far, they've not proposed something that would be reasonable. So there is no settlement at this stage, so it remains under appeal. I believe the trial, again, barring anything changing, the trial would take place in May for that, and then it might be 1 to 3 months sort of thing, for a ruling or decision to be made by the court. And then depending on the ruling, either party could appeal that. So that's sort of still in flux.
and
Those units cannot be added until that appeal is resolved.
So what about the building permit? Are those affected by the building permit issuance for them to be added?
There is no building permit at this stage.
No, I understand, but so we need to wait for the judgment and any appeal process to be completed for those to be eligible. But then does it also need to wait for a building permit like the Richmond units to be eligible?
What'll trigger those units being eligible has to do with the tax credit financing.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what would be the timeline on that?
Well, the tax credits are awarded generally yearly. Sometimes they do a interim round, but this week actually is when the tax credit application is due. And so the unresolved appeal actually is problematic with respect to that.
So nearest we're looking is 2020 for those. If we apply for the tax credits in that period because of the appeal now, it won't qualify in this.
If the tax credit authority, which is DHCD, said, this is still under appeal, therefore you won't be considered for tax credits in this round, yes, it would push it back a year.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Unless there was a mini round, which they sometimes do.
Okay.
Tucker, can you just clarify one thing? The maximum safe harbor we can get from Richmond is 2 years.
Yes.
For the entire project.
Yes.
So this is something that I didn't understand.
Yeah.
That them applying for building permits at the rate of 48 every 2 years wouldn't give us perpetual safe harbor till they built all 225 rental units. No. Right. So
that project is worth 2 years of safe harbor at any given time.
Right.
And it's likely that it would be
the
in
way that
2019.
it was originally, going back several years, the way that it was originally designed and proposed, yes. I mean, if could you break it up. Like they would have to reapply for their permitting and so forth. But, in theory, could you break it up? Yes. But as a practical matter, no.
Yeah, I just wanted to make it clear that it can't be meted out as a strategy for shyless management, because that's something that I thought could happen and I was wrong. So.
No.
Are we also 2 units short of getting safe harbor without Richmond?
No, the
No.
22 units?
Yeah.
No.
No. Okay.
Because the 10 Sachem's Path units go
right.
back to 2012. The 7 Beach Plum actually go back to like 2006. So we're
Okay.
getting 17 units of credit for a long time ago.
So we're not even close to
Right.
24.
Yeah, no, we're not even anywhere in the ballpark.
Okay. So
Yeah.
that's just 18 on the shy, but those are including all the older ones.
Right.
Basically everything that we have.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, for example, the Housing Nantucket development at Surfside Road will add 4 units this year.
Mm-hmm.
So if we, if we add 20 more units in the year, say Richmond for some reason wasn't going somewhere, we added 20 more units from somewhere else, we would have a year of safe harbor this
Okay.
year. And so the final thing I was going to say is, so if you just assume for a moment that Richmond was moving forward as planned, it will ultimately add 225 rental units, 19 homeownership units under the recent MOA. So 244 total units, which is basically half of our 490 requirement. And 6 fairgrounds, if you assume that gets resolved and move forward, that's 64 additional units. So we would be 39 units short of the 490, so that's just in the context of some of these other things that, so for example, with the Nantucket Inn project, that project, depending on the programming that we decided as a community to put in there, that would take us over the top. Or we were talking about the fire station earlier, that might provide around 30 of that 39, and that's not addressing Surfside Crossing. And, what if, depending where that project ended up going.
You must get asked that question multiple times a week.
Yes.
I was looking at the Housing Nantucket report from November that did a good job laying out status at that point. And you were talking about dashboard for other reasons. It occurred to me, to save you having to go through that long story repeatedly, I wonder if there's any way that there could be an updatable website that
We're on the same wavelength.
yeah,
Yes.
because you
So,
must get
yeah.
tired of that. But thank you for doing it. I thought, especially since we were recording, that getting you on tape, that you could just say, here it is, go there.
No, thank you for the opportunity to talk about it here. And yes, so it's, for example, with the Ripple Effect website, that is a data point that we just want to have out there for folks to refer to easily, especially going into town meeting.
Yes, Brooke.
So just another board comment. Tucker's mentioned Ripple Effect. Tucker and I are together working on doing some community outreach around the housing question in our role as the organizers of Ripple Effect. And we did a presentation at the UU Church a couple Sundays ago. We're going to do one at the First Congregational Church on March 24th. And I'm working on scheduling us in some other non-church community venues and inviting the public in. And the format basically is, we do a little speech. We show the video that we created through Ripple Effect and do a Q&A. So I'll keep you guys posted as we schedule more of those in the coming weeks, leading up to town meeting in particular. Just giving the community opportunity to talk and ask questions about the various proposals and what's going on. And we are putting together a frequently asked questions sheet that will include this shy list information as well that we'll be handing out through that. So I'll keep you guys posted on that. And so.
Great, thanks.
Any other board comments? Hearing none. Public comments? Hearing none. Moving on. Is there any other business anyone would like to bring to the board at this time? No? Okay. So now it looks like we're going to move into an executive session. Linda not being here, Megan, I'm going to look to you for some process assistance.
Motion
So we,
close open session, not to close open session, not to resume open session, is that? Did I read that properly?
And not-
right, so that when we close the executive session, then the whole thing is adjourned, right?
And you have to vote by roll call, and as soon as you're done doing that, I'm going to call NCTV and have them cut the cameras, because we're on live stream.
Great.
So I move that we close the open session for executive session, not to reopen the open session,
Do I have a second?
public
Second.
session. Second.
Oh,
Is there,
we have a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
roll call, has to be roll
Oh.
call.
Rita, I.
Judith, aye.
Brian, aye.
Brooke, aye.
Trudy Grace,
Rima Sherry, aye.
I
Great.
am going to